It's my privilege to introduce Professor Oscar Traynor. He's a transplant and HPB surgeon who for many years headed and was the director of the St. Vincent University Hospital unit in Dublin, and is Director of International Surgical Training Programs at the Royal College of Surgeons in Ireland. He's also the outgoing examiner for our MSc in Surgical Practice. For over 25 years, he was the Dean of Postgraduate Surgical Education and Training, responsible for all surgical training in Ireland. And he's credited for introducing several innovations to surgical training, including the world's first e-learning program for surgical trainees. He, of course, lectures all over the world, and in 2021 was awarded an honorary fellowship by the American College of Surgeons. And in 2022, he became the first Irish surgeon to enter the Academy of Master Surgeon Educators in the United States. Professor Traynor will talk to us about competence and expertise, navigating the challenges of an outcomes-based surgical curriculum. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael, and good morning, everybody. I'd firstly like to thank the Department of Surgery at the John Radcliffe for inviting me to speak at the Grand Rounds this morning. It's a great honour for me to speak here today. I'd also like to thank my colleagues in the University of Oxford, particularly Richard and Peter and Michael, with whom I've worked very closely over the past 4 years as the external examiner for the Masters in Surgical Science and Practice. It's been a great honour for me to fulfil that role over the period of 4 years. So I would like to talk this morning about the whole area of competence and expertise in surgical training. Surgery is fundamentally different to most other postgraduate medical specialties, in as much as it is at the same time a science, a craft, and an art. The science is the knowledge and judgment that we need in order to safely care for our patients. The craft is the technical skill required to actually perform surgical procedures. And the art is the collection of non-technical skills or human factors required to perform effectively as part of a modern, multidisciplinary, multi-professional team. Because surgery is science, craft, and art, training in surgery is always going to be somewhat more challenging than training in non-craft disciplines such as psychiatry, pathology, or internal medicine. The traditional model of training in surgery has been the apprenticeship model for more than 300 years. Now, apprenticeship in surgery is not much different in principle to apprenticeship in any other craft-based discipline, such as carpentry, plumbing, or electricity. Essentially, it's an experiential model, and the apprentice or trainee is attached to a master or trainer, and they learn first by watching the master at work, then by doing parts of tasks under supervision, then by doing full tasks under supervision, and then finally doing full tasks under progressively less supervision until they are deemed competent to perform the tasks independently. That's what apprenticeship is. That's how it works. Now, the apprenticeship concept was formally incorporated into a structured residency program by the great American surgeon William Halsted at Johns Hopkins towards the end of the 19th century. The Halsted residency gave prospective surgical trainees graduated responsibility for the care of surgical patients, whilst at the same time putting a major focus on the basic sciences and on the importance of research. But very importantly, there was no formal assessment as part of this residency model, and instead, competence was assumed to be synonymous with experience, that is, time spent in training. Now, the apprenticeship model has in fact served us very well for well over 100 years and has produced countless generations of fine surgeons all around the world. But there are two essential ingredients which are absolutely important for the success of the apprenticeship model. The first is the opportunity to engage in a large volume of repeated practice, and that involves working long hours over many years. But the second, equally important ingredient is the relationship that develops between trainer and trainee, a relationship based on long working relationships, whereby the trainer really gets to know the trainee, understands their strengths and weaknesses and their particular learning needs. Without these two ingredients, apprenticeship cannot work. So over the past 15 years, we have seen significant challenges for this traditional apprenticeship model of surgical training. The first challenge we introduced ourselves. Back in 2007, the new, as it was then, the new intercollegiate surgical curriculum program reduced the duration of surgical training to 8 years. Previously, surgical trainees spent 12 to 14 years in training, and overnight we reduced that to 8 years. And at pretty much exactly the same time, the European Working Time Directive was introduced, which restricted the number of hours worked per week to 48 hours, whereas previously trainees in surgery typically worked 95 to 100 hours per week or more. So these two introductions in 2007, 2008 dramatically impacted on those two key ingredients that I've just spoken about: the opportunity to engage in a large volume of repeated practice, and, just as importantly, the relationship between trainer and trainee. But there was more. Around the same time, we began to see a massive explosion in the use of technology in surgical practice. And that, of course, had an impact on the ability of trainees to actually perform surgical procedures, particularly the more junior surgical trainees. Also, we've seen an increasing focus on the importance of meeting service targets, and that, of course, has an impact on the amount of time available for training. Certainly in Ireland, and I think here in the UK also, there's been significant cancellations of elective surgery because of pressures on the emergency departments around the country. And finally, there have been changing public expectations. The public no longer wish to be used as training material for junior surgeons, and instead, quite understandably, want their operations performed by the most senior, most experienced member of the team. And as if all of that wasn't enough, at the same time, the regulator, the General Medical Council and the Medical Council in Ireland, have been increasing the pressure for us to verify and document the competence of our trainees at the end of training. So what all of this means is that for the past 10 years or so, the traditional model of training that we've used in surgery has essentially been on life support and is in imminent danger of demise. But lest you think that the apprenticeship model is gone altogether out of medical education and training, nothing could be further from the truth. Because last year, the UK government, in its wisdom, announced the introduction of new doctor apprenticeships. These are apprenticeships whereby medical students would work as apprentices in the NHS whilst they're studying for their undergraduate medical degree. Now, there's a new concept. So I'm not going to focus on that. I really want to focus on the opportunities that we have in surgery to rethink the model of training for surgical training for the future. The challenges that we've had over the past 10 years present an opportunity to redesign surgical training for the future. And as we do so, we can perhaps ask ourselves two basic questions. Firstly, how do other high-risk industries train their people? And secondly, what will surgical practice look like in the year 2050? Because the reality is that surgical trainees that we are training today will be at the peak of their consultant careers in the year 2050. And we need to have some ideas about what surgical practice will look like when these people are at the peak of their careers. So let's look firstly at how other high-risk industries train their people, particularly for mission-critical high-risk situations and tasks. I'm talking about industries like the offshore oil drilling industry, aviation, the nuclear power industry, military defence forces. What they all have in common is that they have clearly defined the competencies that are expected at the end of training, and they have clearly articulated those competencies, and they train to competence. And this implies that training is competency-based rather than time-based, and a major part of their training takes place in a non-critical environment through simulation. The concept of competency-based training implies that it's supported by a robust assessment framework, whereby we can reliably verify and document the competence of trainees at the end of their training. So could we do something like this in surgery? Well, we could certainly define the competencies. We are working towards increasing the use of simulation in surgical training. We definitely need to take assessment much more seriously than we do right now. And we need to move towards professionalization of trainings, whereby trainers are specifically trained for their role as medical trainers. And we need a system whereby progression in surgical training is based on the achievement of competencies. Now, we have, in fact, gone a good deal down that road already. The Intercollegiate Surgical Curriculum Programme is an excellent example of collaborative collaboration between the 4 surgical Royal Colleges in the United Kingdom and Ireland. Going back 25 years to 2002, the JCST set up a working group to define a curriculum for surgical training for all surgical specialties. Now, today, it might seem very hard to believe that prior to 2002, there was actually no defined curriculum across all 10 surgical specialties. Everybody had their own curriculum, but it was an inadequately articulated curriculum. And so this was really the first attempt to put down a fully defined, structured curriculum, which was a standard curriculum across all 10 surgical specialties. So the working group defined the structure of training and the outcomes of training. It also defined the syllabus, what will be learned, the pedagogy, how it will be taught, and the assessment framework. And it also defined the roles and responsibilities of trainers. So this 5-year program of development was finally concluded in 2007, and the new curriculum was introduced for the first time in August 2007. There was a standard framework across all specialties. The standards of training were clearly defined. There was a requirement that there would be qualified trainers. There was a very elaborate assessment framework, and there was an outcomes-based progression. But the major emphasis of the new curriculum at the time was the assessment framework and the notion of workplace-based assessments was introduced. Now, these workplace-based assessments were considered analogous to building blocks. And there was a great variety of these workplace-based assessments, such as procedure-based assessments, case-based discussions. And the concept was that if you gathered together enough of these building blocks of a sufficient variety and put them all together, you would eventually end up with a well-designed, well-built surgeon. Unfortunately, the reality didn't always meet the expectations. And it soon became apparent that just collecting together all the building blocks and putting them all together didn't necessarily give the desired result. And in fact, it became apparent that there was a fundamental problem with the building blocks. So the first thing that became apparent was that it was extremely difficult to achieve standardization of the WBAs across the United Kingdom and Ireland. Some trainers were extremely conscientious and extremely diligent, and they performed the assessments very conscientiously for their trainees. Others were less diligent and less conscientious. And so there was a mismatch across the country in the degree of conscientiousness of completing these workplace-based assessments. And a large part of the problem was the requirement that trainees would complete 40 workplace-based assessments per annum. Now, 40 per annum is essentially 1 per week if you exclude holidays and study leave. And if you take the average surgical team that has perhaps 2 core surgical trainees, plus an ST3, plus an ST7 or an ST8, that's 4 trainees on the team, all of whom have to do 1 WBA per week throughout the year. That became an impossible burden of assessment for both trainers and trainees. And so what happened was that it kind of descended into a tick box mentality, and the value of the workplace-based assessments was lost. And so around the mid-teens, the General Medical Council stepped in and they produced 2 important landmark documents. The first was Excellence by Design, which laid down the standards for postgraduate curricula in all postgraduate medical specialties, not just surgery. The second one was the Generic Professional Capabilities Framework, which specified the generic competencies that all doctors should have, irrespective of their specialty. And they mandated that all postgraduate specialties would redesign their curricula to comply with the standards and also with the Generic Professional Capabilities Framework. And so all of the SACs in surgery had to undertake a very comprehensive 3-year program of redesigning the ISCP, which was finally relaunched in August 2021. And the cardinal feature of the new curriculum is that it is an outcomes-based surgical curriculum. And they introduced this concept of a day 1 consultant surgeon. So the outcome of the curriculum is the knowledge, skills, and behaviours expected of a day 1 consultant surgeon. It had to be mapped to the GMC's Generic Professional Capabilities Framework and also to these capabilities in practice, which I'll come back to in a moment. And there were various other innovations introduced into the new curriculum, such as the learning agreement, the concept of index procedures, an assessment system, trainee self-assessment, and a multiple consultant report. The multiple consultant report largely replaced the WBAs as the main process for assessing trainees in the new curriculum. And essentially, instead of having tick boxes of a checklist, as in the WBAs, the role was given back to the trainers to provide a holistic professional opinion of how the trainees are performing across a variety of domains, which are known as the capabilities in practice. So these capabilities in practice reflect the activities that a surgeon engages in during a normal working week, such as running an outpatients clinic, managing inpatients and ward rounds, managing a night on call, managing an operating list, and managing a multidisciplinary team meeting. And the reports of the multiple consultant report are based on the performance of trainees across these capabilities in practice. But the ISCP is somewhat light on describing how we should teach these activities and also how we should assess them. Indeed, there is a process for assessing as part of the ARCP, so that trainers working collaboratively, fill in this report as seen here on the right-hand side. So there's a box for free text insertion, and the trainers are facilitated in filling in this box by this descriptors in the orange box on the right-hand side. So if you click on the descriptors, you will see a list of 8 or 10 descriptors that the trainers can use to fill in the free text box. Now, human nature being what it is, the vast majority of trainers, I suspect, will go straight to the descriptors and they will pick out 3 or 4 of those non-specific descriptors and put them into the assessment box. And so we won't have an authentic appreciation of how the trainee is performing. And instead we'll have boxes which are filled in by predetermined descriptors. So what I'd like to do now is just describe a little bit about what we are doing in the Royal College of Surgeons of Ireland in order to comply with the requirements of the new intercollegiate surgical curriculum. We have a brand new education building at our campus in the centre of Dublin, which opened in 2017 and includes almost 3,500 square metres of simulation space on the top 3 floors. We are, and always have been, heavily engaged with simulation in our college. And our simulation programme has 2 phases. The first phase is the surgical boot camp, which all trainees must undertake prior to commencement of core surgical training. So before they even start their first week in the workplace, they come to the college for a 5-day intensive course in both technical and non-technical skills. Then after that, during training, they come to our simulation centre 6 days per year. These are not 6 days grouped together, but instead they're dispersed across the year so that they get distributed practice rather than massed practice. And they come 6 days per year for the first 6 years of surgical training. So there's 36 modules of technical skills training which they must complete. The boot camp is a 5-day course. The first half of each day, the morning, is devoted to technical skills, where the trainees learn the core technical skills that they need in order to hit the ground running when they start in the workplace. So they do knot tying, suturing, wound closure, anastomosis, surgical technique. And then in the afternoon, they do non-technical skills, such as the management of common surgical problems, critical care, emergency care, and various aspects of caring for yourself in a surgical career. And then following boot camp, they engage in the operative surgical skills course, which, as I said, is 6 days a year across the first 6 years of surgical training. And so they come to our simulation centre and they receive syllabus-based tuition across a large range of surgical procedures with experienced surgical faculty and a high tutor-to-trainee ratio. For these training days, they use a variety of models, including both synthetic models and biological models. But we also have invested heavily in high-end virtual reality simulators. And the trainees love playing with the simulators, but it's not about playing with the toys. Instead, we adopt the principles outlined by Anders Ericsson from the University of South Florida. Anders Ericsson, who sadly passed away 4 years ago, is a psychologist originally from Sweden who devoted his entire career to performance science and what leads to expert performance. And he developed this concept of deliberate practice and the importance of deliberate practice in achieving expert performance. And he also developed the concept of this 10,000-hour rule. Basically, he says that for any domain in life, whether it's surgery or music or sports or the arts, in any domain in life, you need to engage in 10,000 hours of practice in order to become an expert in that field. Well, we don't put our trainees through 10,000 hours of practice, but we do use those principles of deliberate practice. And essentially, our day starts off by explaining to the trainees the task and the various steps in the task that they're going to be performing during the day. We then define the performance standards for those tasks, and then the trainees practice. And they receive feedback, which is both proximate, in other words, as soon as possible, and structured. Then they're encouraged to achieve higher standards, that's coaching. Then they practice more, they receive more feedback, and they engage in more practice. And we also assess the trainees and record their progression. So as you can see here, there are a minimum of 2 video cameras above each skills station in our skills lab. And so everything that the trainees do during their training day is recorded, and it's stored in our learning management system called Learning Space. Now, this allows us to track the progress of trainees over time and to compare the progress of individual trainees with their peers who are at the same level of training. But it also allows the trainees themselves to access their own videos on their smartphone. So in the days or weeks after a skills training day, they can, on their own smartphone, look and review their own performance, and most importantly, can review the feedback that they got from the trainer during the training day. Now, of course, you cannot become an expert surgeon in a skills lab, just as you cannot become an expert golfer on the driving range. But the skills lab is an important step in the pathway to competence in operative surgery. And we believe that the skills lab is where surgical trainees should acquire the basic skills. And they do this through demonstration, then practice, then feedback, then coaching. And they stay in this loop of demonstration, practice, feedback, and coaching until they are ready for assessment and documentation of proficiency. And in the early years of training, we have annual skills assessments that we run in the college that are separate from the training days. And the trainees are put through a variety of OSCE-style stations, and they're scored on their performance in those stations. And they are high-stakes assessments in the sense that the score that they achieve in those stations does count towards career progression. So the score they get in their annual assessments is incorporated into the selection process for ST3. As you know, there's competitive progression from core training into ST3, and the annual skills assessment that we perform accounts for 10% of the total marks for progression to ST3. Now, they acquire their basic skills in the skills lab. They develop their skills in the workplace, in the hospital, in the real live operating theatre. And they do this initially through practice under observation, then documentation of capability, and then they gradually start to accumulate experience, achieve competence, and eventually get to a stage of expertise or mastery. And along the way, we have assessments. They do procedure-based assessments, which are an integral part of the intercollegiate curriculum, and they also keep an up-to-date logbook. Now, I'd like to just spend a few moments talking about the RCSI logbook, because we have our own logbook that we've devised in-house ourselves. We don't use the ISCP logbook. We all know that a surgeon's logbook is a very important part of their record of surgical experience. It doesn't tell us anything about skill level or competence, but it does give an overview of the breadth of surgical experience, and therefore is a very important component of our assessment of competence. The problem is that logbooks are notoriously difficult to assess. It's difficult to assess an individual surgeon's logbook, but it's even more difficult to assess large groups of trainees and to compare them with each other, and to compare the well-performing with the more poorly performing. And so the logbook that we've devised It was designed entirely by this man, Donica Ryan, who is our learning technology guru in the college. And it is heavily based on metrics and analytics. Metrics are objective measurements, and analytics are meaningful reports that are generated from those metrics. So every surgical trainee in Ireland must use our logbook, and the logbook generates a score, a numerical score, which is based not only on the volume of cases, but also on the complexity of the procedures they've been involved in and their role in the procedure, whether they were an assistant or performed under supervision or performed independently. And it works like this. For every surgical operation, there are potentially 100 points. 75% of the points are awarded for the role of the trainee in the procedure, assistant, performed under supervision, or performed independently. And 25% of the points are awarded for the complexity, subminor, minor, intermediate, major, or major complex. And there's a different amount of points awarded for each of those categories. So just to show an example here, this is an excision of a lipoma performed under supervision. So because it's performed under supervision, the trainee gets 90% of the possible 75 points, that's 67.5. The complexity is minor, so they only get 40% of the 25. So that's 10 points. So the total is 77.5. And as they enter their operations in the logbook, their score begins to accumulate. And on the app that we have an app for all our trainees, which they can access on their smartphone. The app is called M-Surgery. On their M-Surgery app, they can see at a glance in real time how their score is progressing in comparison to the mean score of all the other surgical trainees in Ireland who are in the same year of training. So in this case, the blue line is the particular trainee involved, and you can see that this particular trainee is ahead of the mean score of all the other trainees. Now, shortly after we introduced this logbook, our trainees came back to us and said, well, I did part of the procedure myself, but I was assisting for other parts. Can I get an additional credit for doing part of the procedure? And so we now have introduced a system whereby they can get additional credit for part performing a procedure. So essentially, we've divided every operation into 5 phases: opening, preliminary dissection and exposure, resection, reconstruction, and closure. And they can get an additional score if they've done any of those parts of the procedure. Because all of this information is housed centrally in our college, we can produce real-time information about surgical activity in every hospital in Ireland. I can honestly say that we have more up-to-date information about surgical activity in every hospital in Ireland than our Department of Health. No question about it. We have up-to-date information about what type of surgery is being performed, what the involvement of the consultants and trainers are in the various operations, how complex the surgery is. So we have information about all the hospitals, and we can tell which hospitals are good training sites and which hospitals are not performing well. Also, from the trainer's perspective, we can generate reports at the end of each year to show how many procedures they have scrubbed in and assisted their trainees for. And we can generate reports for trainers, which they can use for CPD to comply with the requirements of their professional competence scheme for the Medical Council. So there's an added bonus for trainers here as well, because they can generate activity and information which they can use for their professional competence scheme. Another problem that we discovered at an early stage of our logbook is that it would be theoretically possible to accumulate a large score by doing a large number of a very limited number of procedures. For example, a large number of upper GI endoscopies. And so we wanted to introduce diversification of the procedures. And so what we did was we asked every specialty to produce a list of 12 to 15 index procedures for their specialty, the procedures that they consider to be the core procedures for their specialty. And having defined the index procedures, we then asked them to define how many of each procedure they would expect trainees to have performed at the end of core training, at the end of year 6, and at the end of year 8. And based on this, we then constructed a dashboard of the index procedures. And the dashboard looks something like this. This is for trauma and orthopedics for core training. So you can see there's 12 or 15 procedures there. And the horizontal bars are the percentage of the indicative number of index procedures that this trainee has already achieved. So every time a trainee enters a procedure into their logbook, it automatically populates their dashboard, and so they can see at a glance how they are progressing in terms of achieving the indicative numbers of index procedures. Now, surgery is not all about technical skills and operative ability. The reality is the environment that we work in as surgeons is a complex environment, an environment in which complex interactions take place between human beings and other human beings on the one hand, and between human beings and machines or technology on the other hand. And in such a complex environment, the potential for things to go wrong is enormous. And the way that we behave when things go wrong has a profound impact on clinical outcomes and patient safety. In a nutshell, that's what human factors is all about. It's about the way that we interact with our environment, with other human beings and with machines or technology, and the impact that has on clinical outcomes and patient safety. At RCSI, we have been long-term advocates of the importance of human factors in surgical practice. And we have a syllabus-based program of human factors training, which is mandatory for all surgical trainees from CST right up to ST8. Our human factors program includes modules on human personality and behavior, human performance and error, teamwork and leadership, communication skills, decision-making and judgment, negotiation and conflict resolution, and various aspects of human overload. And our trainees come to the college 3 days every year. This is separate to their 6 days of technical skills training. They come for 3 days of human factors training. As far as possible, we try to include the other members of the team, anaesthetists, postgraduate nurses, physiotherapists, pharmacists, and we engage in realistic simulations in which there's a preliminary briefing, then practical exercises, and then a debriefing based on video recordings of what happens during the simulations. And there's regular reinforcements. And just as with the technical skills, we have annual assessments of human factors, where they are put through a variety of OSCE stations, and they are scored for their performance according to the human factors syllabus. And again, these assessments are high-stakes assessments, and they also feed into the selection process for ST3. Just as with the technical skills, they account for an additional 10% of the total marking system for ST3 progression. Now we are currently working on development of simulations to teach the capabilities in practice. Ward rounds, outpatient clinics, nights on call. And for the ward rounds, we deal with common surgical conditions and teach them the preoperative and postoperative care, the importance of multidisciplinary team working, and the importance of communication. But there's a particular emphasis on early recognition of the deteriorating patient, because it's becoming increasingly clear that failure to rescue is one of the principal factors in avoidable surgical postoperative deaths. conducting these simulated ward rounds, we are fortunate in RCSI to have a large bank of simulated patients. These are members of the public who have volunteered to be surgical patients, and they're specifically trained for that purpose. And so these volunteers become our simulated patients. We also do simulated outpatient clinics, and the focus of these is communication and breaking bad news and dealing with conflict with patients. And we have simulated nights on call. And these are very realistic scenarios. This is really where the rubber hits the road, so to speak. This is where the technical skills and human factors really come together in the management of complex trauma and emergency surgical procedures. Now, the second question that we need to look at in redesigning our surgical curriculum is, what will surgical practice look like in 2050? Well, of course, it's very difficult to predict the future, but there are some things we do know about how surgical practice will change. Firstly, we know that there's going to be a lot more complex technology. Secondly, there'll be a major increase in our requirement to verify and document competence. And thirdly, undoubtedly, there will be a shift towards lifelong recurrent training. So the practice of surgery is becoming more and more embedded in complex technology. Technologies like robotic surgery, advanced minimally invasive surgery, these are all technologies which are radically changing the way that we deliver surgical care to our patients. Our surgeons of the future will need to be trained not only how to do the operation, but also how to safely manage the technology. And it is not appropriate that that training takes place in the real live operating theatre whilst working with real life patients. That training needs to take place remotely in the safe environment of a surgical simulation centre. Now, I'm happy to say that we have made significant steps in that direction, and I'll just use one example of where a specialty association has really taken the lead in developing training in a new technology. So the European Association of Urology has a specific section called the ERUS, or European Association of Urology Robotic Urology section, and they've done tremendous work on developing a robotic curriculum for teaching cystectomy, prostatectomy, partial nephrectomy. And it's based on the concept of proficiency-based training. So what they did setting out was they brought together 28 international experts, acknowledged experts in the field, and they engaged in a modified Delphi consensus process to define the 11 steps of a robotic radical cystectomy with intracorporeal ileal conduit. Those 11 steps were initially put into chronological order. Then they disaggregated the chronological order and instead regrouped them into 5 groups of the same level of complexity. So group 1 were the simple steps, group 5 were the more complex steps, irrespective of where they come in the chronological sequence of the operation. And then they designed a program which had 4 phases: theoretical training, which is based on e-learning and case observation; then preclinical simulation-based training, which is in the wet lab; then clinical modular training, which takes place in the workplace with a certified trainer in a certified centre; and eventually assessment and evaluation, where the trainee would perform a complete procedure, and this would be then reviewed blindly by an independent assessor based on video recordings. And they've shown already that this approach can dramatically reduce the learning curve and can assure us that people setting out on robotic surgery have the skills and the competencies in order to safely perform the procedure. So the next step is verification and documentation of competence. Undoubtedly, we are going to have a more robust assessment process than we do right now. And again, the ERAS program has shown the lead in this. So this shows a checklist for radical prostatectomy. And they have defined no less than 81 individual steps in a prostatectomy. And they've grouped them into 12 phases of the operation. So shown here, one of those phases, bladder neck dissection, and the different steps in that phase of the procedure. And for every step, they've defined the standards for the performance of that step, and they've also outlined the errors that could be made during performance of that step. And so the assessments are based on the steps and the standards. We're also making some progress in terms of professionalization of training. So the Academy of Medical Educators, 10 years ago now, set out some preliminary standards for medical educators. And those standards have been adopted by the Edinburgh College and its faculty of surgical trainers, and they have elaborated on those standards for surgical trainers. The final question about what surgical training will look like in the future relates to lifelong recurrent training. There is no question that training will not end at the end of ST8 in the future. There will be a requirement for all of us to undergo lifelong recurrent training throughout our careers. This is partly driven by the knowledge explosion, partly driven by technology advances, and, dare I say it, partially driven by the increasing age profile of our surgical workforce. This issue was recently addressed by the Board of Regents of the American College of Surgeons, who issued this policy statement just a few weeks ago now. Stunningly, in 10 years' time, 40% of physicians in the United States will be over 65 years of age. And we all know and recognize that past the age of 65, human beings begin to have some cognitive decline and begin to have some decline in their psychomotor function. That's inevitable. But despite that, the American College does not support a mandatory retirement age because the onset and the rate of decline varies so significantly from individual to individual. Problem is, surgeons may not on their own recognize or accept the deterioration of their physical and cognitive function with age. And so the American College is now proposing that there should be a comprehensive lifelong assessment program inclusive of all physicians, and this will create a culture of safety, equity and transparency in monitoring those potential declines that could affect surgical competency. So the ACS strongly recommends the implementation of a comprehensive whole-of-career testing process for surgeons and surgical trainees, regardless of age and experience. Finally, as I finish, I just want to stress that in this age of rapidly advancing technology and just around the corner, the age of artificial intelligence, we must never forget that our patients are fellow human beings who are sick, unwell, or possibly even in danger of dying. And they turn to us as doctors in the hope that we can make them better, cure them, or maybe even save their lives. For sure, they want us to cure, but they also need us to care. Empathy and compassion are extremely important and have been ever since the time of Hippocrates in 450 BC. At the end of the day, our patients don't really care how much we know until they know how much we care. Caring counts. Caring matters. Empathy and compassion are core elements of medical professionalism. They always have been, and they always will be. Thank you.